reporting it on their taxes? Because they're not necessarily going to be getting a package from from the church.
So the key is you don't necessarily need a separate ID number. What you do, what we recommend, or what I recommend, is in order to keep, one of the ways to keep good records is to use one debit card, one credit card, one bank account for your clergy activity, or for your ministry related activity, or for your self-employment activity. So that, you know, what happens is when we're commingling stuff, that's when things kind of get lost and kind of get, harder to track, and there's not clarity. And if for some reason one of the regulatory agencies did want to look at you, now you got to open up your whole life. So my recommendation always is for your any kind of business, but specifically for clergy activity, I would use one separate, if you could use a separate bank account, that would be great. But a bank account with one debit card, one credit card, just for clergy related activities. And that will help you keep a cleaner audit trail. And it will help you keep, it will also, record keeping. You know, if you're going to minimize your taxes, you got to minimize your taxes, you got to have the records. So many of us leave so much money on the table at tax time because we don't have the records. We're just guessing. We know we did it, but you know, we just don't have the records. So at a minimum, if you just use one debit card, credit card, at least you'll have a pretty good audit trail, and you'll have records of most, if not all, of your clergy related activity. So ministers have this special rule that they can receive a housing and parsonage allowance.
I'm sorry, Connor. Before you go on, can we go back to the previous slide? I want to make sure this question was answered.
Okay.
It may have been, but so the question is, can you pay quarterly after the income tax payment was due, or can you pay the SC taxes quarterly prior to the income tax due date and report the quarterly payments on your taxes?
Yes. So the IRS is going to take your money whenever you send it. Okay, so you can pay it early if that, works better for you. You can pay it, as soon as you want to. And if you don't have the resources, you can file it late. You can pay it late. Now, when you file your tax return, the IRS asks the question, the schedule that you have to use to report your payments. And they will ask you when the payments were made. They will reconcile that with their records of when it was received. And if it was not paid on time, early or on time, they could assess you penalties for being late in filing estimated payments. Does that answer the question?
I think so. The person said, just so they're clear, this only applies if you are receiving income from your church.
Well, we're talking about church today, but if you are self-employed, then you're required, and you get honorariums or, consulting income, then yes, you are required to make quarterly estimated payments.
Right. So if, so you could have contracted services with the church. You could be getting offerings from different places. All of that would fit.
Honorariums, right. All of those sources of income, all income is required to be paid in at least quarterly, for clergy, ministers, self-employed or employed.
Great. Thank you.
Okay.
I think.
All right. So another benefit for ministers is a housing and parsonage allowance. So ministers are allowed to receive housing and parsonage allowance as part of their compensation. And for income tax purposes, the housing allowance is not taxable. So this is a real tax benefit for clergy. I'm going to say that again. Housing and parsonage allowance is not taxable for income tax purposes. However, it is taxable for SECA tax purposes. The church has to officially designate the housing annually. So you can't just arbitrarily during the course of the year or at the end of or tax time say, I'm going to allocate a part of my income to housing. It has to be specifically designated by the church's budget or by a church meeting, and official records that the church has designated a housing allowance or parsonage to the pastor in order for it to be excluded for income tax purposes. Okay.
Just one comment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One person is saying they had no idea they had to make estimated payments. This is so helpful because I didn't know I had to pay it quarterly. I will pay it now and then file later, hoping I can miss the penalty. So thank you so much. You are helping us. Um,
Great, great.
Question about the housing allowance. Is the housing allowance taxable for the state?
Which state? Pennsylvania. I'm here in Philadelphia. So Pennsylvania, yes, housing allowance is taxable. New Jersey, no, housing allowance is not taxable. So it depends on what state you're in. So, which is why I kind of didn't include the state in here because I wasn't sure what state we were representing. But yes, for Pennsylvania tax purposes, it is taxable. New Jersey, it is not taxable. Hopefully that's helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, if there's other states, feel free, to call me. We're familiar, we do all 50 states and international, so we're familiar with the rules. So the housing allowance, again, has to be officially designated in order to be considered housing allowance. However, it is taxable for SECA purposes. Okay, so for Social Security, SECA, it is taxable, so it would be added to your base salary for that purpose. So housing allowance, there are 3 ways that you determine what your housing allowance is. Some clergy actually get a housing allowance. They actually get a dollar amount to pay for their housing expenses. Some actually, churches own a facility and they get a parsonage. They're allowed to use the church's facility as a parsonage. So for tax purposes, there are 3 ways that you determine what your housing allowance is.